Sometimes the loneliest souls carry the deepest pain, and sometimes love finds us when we least deserve it. In the cold mountains of ancient Norway, there lived a giant named Thorlund, who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as human. The villagers called him Thorlund the Bearblood. They feared his massive frame and the terrible scars that marked his face and hands. Mothers pulled their children inside when he passed. Men crossed themselves and looked away. For 7 long winters, he lived alone in the wilderness, cast out, for reasons no one dared speak of. His only companions were his rage and his memories of better days long buried. But then came Inga, a blind weaver who lost her way in his woods. She could not see the monster everyone else saw. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bronze bell of Ravenshollow rang across the fjord each morning, calling the villagers to their daily labors, its clear tone carrying hope and community to every home. But high in the granite peaks above, where the mists clung to ancient pines, and the wind sang songs of forgotten battles, Thorlund the Bearblood heard that bell as a reminder of all he had lost. 7 winters had passed since his exile, 7 long seasons of survival in the harsh Norwegian wilderness, where lesser men would have perished within days. His shelter was a crude affair, carved into the living rock of the mountainside, reinforced with timber he had felled with his own hands and chinked with moss and clay against the bitter cold. Inside, the walls were blackened with smoke from countless fires, and in the corner, propped against a natural ledge, stood his broken war shield. The shield bore the deep gouge of an axe blow that had split it nearly in 2 during his final battle as a member of his clan. The painted bear that had once marked him as Thorlund Bjornsson, son of Bjorn the Mighty, was now cracked and faded, the proud symbol of his lineage reduced to peeling fragments of red and gold. He had kept it not from sentiment, but as a reminder of what he had been before honor demanded. He becomes something else entirely. Each dawn, Thorlund would emerge from his rocky den to survey his domain. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, and arms thick as ship's masts, he was a sight that would have struck fear into the hearts of enemies across a dozen battlefields. His hair, once golden as summer, wheat, had grown dark and wild, hanging past his shoulders in tangled braids, adorned with small bones and metal rings. His beard, streaked with premature grey, covered scars that told stories of violence and survival. But it was his eyes that marked him most clearly as a man apart from civilization. They were the color of winter storms, grey-blue and distant, holding depths of pain that no amount of time seemed able to heal. When traders occasionally glimpsed him from the valley paths below, they would cross themselves and mutter prayers, for those eyes spoke of a soul that had looked upon darkness and found it reflected within himself. The villagers of Ravenshollow, nestled in their safe harbour far below, knew him only through whispered legends that grew more terrible with each telling. Mothers would quiet crying children with warnings that Thorlund the Bearblood would come for them if they misbehaved. Young warriors boasted of what they would do if the giant ever dared show his face in their village, though their voices carried more bravado than conviction. The elders, who remembered the truth of his exile, kept their silence and their own counsel. Down in that village, where smoke rose from stone chimneys and life proceeded with the comfortable rhythms of community, lived a woman who had never seen Thorlund's fearsome visage, nor any other sight since the fever that claimed her vision in her 3rd year of life. Inga Eriksdottir was known throughout Ravenshollow and the neighbouring settlements as the finest weaver in 3 fjords, her skilled fingers capable of creating tapestries so beautiful that visiting jarls would offer substantial sums for her work. At 27 winters, Inga possessed a beauty that was both striking and serene, with hair the colour of autumn leaves that she kept braided with ribbons she had woven herself. Her face was heart-shaped and gentle, marked by laugh lines. that spoke of a spirit that had found joy despite her affliction. Her hands, small and precise, moved across her loom with the confidence of one who had learned to navigate the world through touch and sound rather than sight. Inga's home sat at the edge of the village proper, close enough to the central square, that she could hear the daily commerce and conversations that kept her connected to her community, yet far enough from the harbour that the crash of waves would not interfere with her work. Her dwelling was modest but comfortable, with thick walls that held the warmth of her hearth, and windows that she kept open to let in the sounds and scents that painted her world in ways others could barely comprehend. Her loom dominated the main room, a massive construction of oak and iron that had belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother before that. The threads that hung from its frame were like a rainbow frozen in time, deep blues drawn from Arctic flowers, rich reds from berries that grew in hidden valleys, golden yellows from the hearts of mountain blooms that appeared only in the brief northern summer. The people of Ravenshollow had long ago learned to appreciate Inga's unique gifts. She could identify visitors by the sound of their footsteps on the wooden planks of her porch, could tell the weather 3 days hence by the way the wind spoke through her window, and could weave patterns so intricate that some claimed they contained magic. Children loved to visit her workshop, for she would tell them stories while she worked, her voice painting pictures as vivid as any their eyes might see. But despite the respect and affection of her community, Inga often felt the isolation that came with her difference. She had never known the face of her mother, who had died in the same fever that claimed her sight. She had never seen a sunset paint the fjord in shades of gold and crimson, never watched the northern lights dance across winter skies, never looked into the eyes of a man and seen her own future reflected there. On quiet evenings, when her work was done and the village settled into sleep around her, Inga would sometimes climb to the small window that faced the mountains and wonder about the man in the stories. Not the monster of the tales told to frighten children, but the real person behind the legend. She had heard enough whispered conversations to piece together fragments of truth, that Thorlund had once been a respected warrior, that his exile had something to do with protecting someone weaker than himself, that whatever he had done had cost him everything he held dear. Her fingers would trace the patterns in her latest weaving as she pondered these mysteries, finding comfort in the familiar textures of wool and silk. She had learned long ago that stories, like tapestries, had layers beneath their surface designs, and that truth was often more complex and beautiful than the simple patterns most people chose to see. Neither Inga nor Thorlund could have imagined, as they went about their separate routines in that early autumn of the 8th year of his exile, that fate was already weaving their threads together in a pattern that would transform them both. High in his mountain fastness, Thorlund checked his snares and sharpened his weapons, preparing for another winter of solitude. Down in her cottage workshop, Inga planned a journey into the forest to gather the rare herbs that would create the deep purple dyes her latest commission required. The village bell rang its evening call as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, and both the exile and the weaver settled into sleep, unaware that their paths would soon cross in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and the wind began to sing a new song, one of change and redemption, and the strange alchemy that occurs when two damaged souls discover they can make each other whole. The storm struck 3 days later with the fury of Thor's own hammer, bringing winds that howled through the fjords like the voices of the dishonored dead. Inga had planned to venture into the forest that morning to gather cloudberries and the rare mountain sage that grew only in the hidden valleys beyond the village boundary. Young Astrid, the blacksmith's daughter, had taken ill with a fever that would not break, and the village healer had requested the precious herbs that might save the child's life. Despite the darkening skies, Inga had felt compelled to make the journey. Her walking staff, a length of seasoned birch carved with intricate patterns by her late father, had been her faithful companion on countless expeditions into the wilderness. She knew these paths as well as any sighted person, perhaps better, for she had learned to read the forest through sounds and scents, through the feel of moss beneath her feet and the way branches whispered their warnings in the wind. The staff had guided her safely through root-tangled deer paths and across swift-running streams, its carved head worn smooth by years of faithful service. But as the storm intensified and the wind began to tear at the ancient trees with unprecedented violence, even her most trusted companion would prove insufficient against nature's wrath. Inga had found the cloudberries easily enough, filling her leather pouch with the orange treasures that would help break Astrid's fever. The mountain sage had proven more elusive, growing only in a narrow canyon she had visited twice before, where the walls protected the delicate plants from harsh weather. She was making her way back through the increasingly violent storm when disaster struck. A massive pine, its roots loosened by weeks of autumn rain, came crashing down across the path just as she passed beneath it. The falling giant missed crushing her by mere inches, but one of its heavy branches struck her walking staff with tremendous force, snapping the faithful birch rod cleanly in two. The crack echoed through the forest like a bone breaking, and Inga found herself suddenly alone in the wilderness, with only a useless stump of wood in her hand. Without her staff to probe the ground ahead, every step became a potential catastrophe. The familiar paths that had seemed as clear as roads now became treacherous mazes of hidden roots and unexpected obstacles. She tried to retrace her steps using memory and instinct, but the storm had disoriented her completely. The wind howled from different directions, confusing her usual navigation by sound, and the rain had washed away the subtle scents that normally guided her homeward. Hours passed as she stumbled through the forest, her hands bleeding from contact with thorns and sharp branches, her dress torn and muddy from numerous falls. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she could feel the first warning signs of the killing cold that claimed unwary travelers in these mountains. Her breath came in visible puffs, and her fingers were beginning to lose feeling despite her efforts to keep them warm. It was in this desperate state that Thorlund found her, though found was perhaps too gentle a word for their violent first encounter. He had been checking his trap lines when he heard the sound of someone crashing through the underbrush with all the subtlety of a wounded bear. His warrior instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile territory, had immediately assumed the worst. Raiders from a rival clan, perhaps, or bandits seeking to establish themselves in his domain, moving with the silent grace that had earned him his fearsome reputation. Thorlund had approached the source of the disturbance with his great war axe ready in his hands. What he discovered defied all his expectations. A woman clearly lost and near exhaustion, stumbling blindly through terrain that would challenge even experienced hunters. Her fine clothes marked her as someone of importance in the village below, but her current state suggested she was far beyond any hope of rescue by her own people. For a long moment, Thorlund simply watched from concealment, his mind warring with itself over what he should do. 7 years of isolation had taught him that survival depended on avoiding all contact with civilization. Every interaction carried the risk of discovery, and discovery meant death, if not from the village warriors who still held grudges against him, then from the slow torture of being forced to relive the events that had driven him into exile. But as he watched Inga collapse against a moss-covered boulder, her strength finally failing, he found himself remembering another woman who had needed protection long ago. The memory of his sister-in-law's bruised face, of her pleading eyes as she begged him not to tell anyone about her husband's cruelty, came flooding back with painful clarity. He had tried to handle that situation with words and warnings, and his restraint had cost a life. This time, action was required, whatever the consequences might be. Inga heard the footsteps approaching through the storm, heavy, deliberate steps that spoke of someone completely at home in this wild place. Her heart hammered with terror as she realized she was no longer alone, for the stories she had heard about the mountain exile painted him as something more beast than man. When a deep voice spoke from somewhere above her, she nearly cried out in fear. "You are far from home, woman." The words were spoken in the old tongue, formal and careful, as if the speaker had not used human speech in a very long time. Inga forced herself to remain still, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I am lost," she said simply, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My walking staff broke in the storm." There was a long silence, and she could sense the presence nearby shifting, as if the speaker was debating something with himself. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of resignation that she found oddly comforting. "The storm will kill you if you remain here. I have shelter." The words were neither invitation nor command, simply a statement of fact delivered without emotion. Inga understood that she faced a choice between certain death from exposure and uncertain fate at the hands of the legendary exile. The decision, when it came, surprised her with its simplicity. "I would be grateful for shelter," she said, struggling. To her feet, with as much dignity as she could muster, she felt rather than saw him step closer, and then a massive hand touched her elbow with surprising gentleness. "Can you walk?" "If you guide me." Thus began the strangest journey of Inga's life, as Thorlund the Bearblood, the man whose very name had frightened her as a child, led her through the storm-lashed forest toward his hidden sanctuary. He spoke only when necessary, warning her of obstacles or guiding her around particularly treacherous terrain, but his touch remained gentle and sure. As they climbed higher into the mountains, away from everything familiar and safe, Inga found herself wondering if she was walking toward salvation or something far more dangerous. The broken pieces of her walking staff, clutched uselessly in her hand, seemed to symbolize more than just a damaged tool. They represented the end of her old life and the beginning of something entirely unknown. Thorlund's shelter was unlike anything Inga had imagined during the long climb through the storm. As he guided her through what felt like a narrow cave entrance, she expected to find herself in some crude hollow scraped from the mountainside. Instead, her hands discovered walls of fitted stone, carefully mortared and smoothed to the touch, and a floor covered with thick furs that spoke of both comfort and skilled craftsmanship. The warmth hit her immediately as Thorlund secured a kind of heavy covering over the entrance, sealing out the howling wind. A fire crackled somewhere ahead of her, its light painting dancing shadows that she could sense rather than see, and the air carried the scents of burning pine and something that might have been stew simmering in an iron pot. "Sit," Thorlund commanded, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. His hand touched her shoulder, guiding her toward what proved to be a bench covered with soft pelts. "You need dry clothes before the cold sickness takes hold." Inga settled gratefully onto the bench, her exhausted body finally allowed to rest after hours of desperate struggle through the forest. She could hear Thorlund moving around the space with the confidence of long familiarity, opening what sounded like wooden chests and stirring the fire to greater brightness. Despite her situation, alone in the wilderness with a man feared throughout the region, she found herself feeling safer than she had since the storm began. "I have garments that might fit," he said, his voice coming from somewhere across the chamber. "They belong to someone who is no longer here." The hesitation in his words suggested painful memories, but Inga chose not to probe. Instead, she accepted the bundle of cloth he placed in her hands, finding garments that felt well-made and clean, if somewhat large for her frame. When he retreated to give her privacy to change, she was struck by the consideration shown by this man who was supposed to be more beast than human. The clothes, a wool dress and thick stockings, carried the faint scent of lavender, as if they had been carefully stored with herbs to keep them fresh. As she changed from her torn and muddy garments, Inga wondered about the woman who had worn these clothes before her. A sister, perhaps, or a wife, who had died young. The careful preservation of these garments suggested someone who had been deeply loved and mourned. "Better?" Thorlund asked when she called out that she was decent. "Much better, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I am Inga Eriksdottir of Raven's Hollow village." There was a long pause before he responded. "I know who you are. Your reputation as a weaver travels even to these heights." His acknowledgement surprised her. She had not expected the legendary exile to know anything about the village below, much less the specific people who lived there. It suggested that his isolation was perhaps not as complete as the stories claimed. "And you are Thorlund Bjornsson," she said quietly, "though I suspect the stories they tell about you are not entirely true." She heard him stiffen, and when he spoke again his voice carried a warning edge. "What stories do they tell? That you are a monster who kills without mercy, that you feast on human flesh and commune with trolls." Inga kept her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "But monsters do not offer dry clothes to lost travelers, nor do they keep such comfortable shelters. You know nothing of what I have done." Thorlund said, his words harsh with old pain. "The stories may not be true in detail, but the spirit of them, the spirit has more truth than you might wish to know." Inga reached into the small pouch she still carried, her fingers finding the smooth stones she had collected from the stream near her home. These river rocks, worn silky by countless years of flowing water, had become her tools for a different kind of weaving, the delicate work of easing pain and tension from muscles made tight by long hours at the loom. "You are injured," she observed, hearing the careful way he moved, the slight hitch in his breathing that spoke of old wounds improperly healed. "May I help?" "Help?" The word came out sharp with suspicion. "I have some skill with healing. These stones, when warmed by the fire, can ease pain from old injuries." She held up one of the smooth rocks, its surface catching the firelight. "It is a small way to repay your kindness." Thorlund was quiet for so long that Inga began to think he would refuse. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than she had yet heard it. "There is pain," he admitted. "It has been a long time since anyone offered to ease it." Under Inga's gentle guidance, Thorlund settled near the fire while she warmed the healing stones in the coals. His presence was massive and intimidating even seated, but she found herself focusing on the sounds he made, the careful way he breathed, the small noises of discomfort when he moved certain ways, the gradual relaxation as her warm stones found the knots of tension in his shoulders and back. Her fingers, trained by years of reading textures in thread and cloth, discovered the landscape of scars that covered his body. Some were clean lines that spoke of sword cuts received and survived in honorable combat. Others were jagged and ugly, the marks of wounds that had healed badly without proper care. Each scar told a story of violence and survival, but beneath them she felt the fundamental strength of a man who had endured more than most could imagine. "You were a great warrior," she said softly as she worked. "It was not a question. Once." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Before I learned that sometimes strength is not enough to protect what matters. And now I protect nothing and no one. It is simpler that way." As Inga continued her ministrations, she sensed the gradual lowering of his defenses. The tension in his muscles began to ease under her gentle touch, and his breathing deepened into something approaching peace. For the first time in 7 years, Thorlund found himself remembering what it felt like to be cared for by another person. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the stone shelter, 2 damaged souls had begun the delicate process of discovering that they might not be as alone in the world as they had believed. The healing stones, smooth and warm in Inga's hands, became the bridge between them, small tokens of trust that would grow into something far more precious than either dared to imagine. 3 days passed before the storm finally exhausted itself. Against the mountain peaks, And in that time, the careful routine that had governed Thorlund's solitary existence began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. What had begun as simple shelter offered to a stranger in need gradually transformed into something neither of them had experienced in years: genuine companionship. Inga had insisted on repaying his kindness through small acts of care that Thorlund found both bewildering and deeply moving. On the second morning, he awoke to find that she had somehow located his small cache of mending supplies and spent the pre-dawn hours repairing tears in his cloak that he had simply learned to ignore. Her fingers, guided by touch alone, had created stitches so small and precise that the damaged fabric looked stronger than it had when new. "You did not need to do this," he had said, running his own calloused fingers over her delicate work. "Perhaps not," she had replied with a small smile, "but I needed to do something useful with my hands. Sitting idle makes me restless." Her presence had brought color to his world in ways he was only beginning to understand. From her traveling pouch, she had produced skeins of thread in shades that transformed his dim shelter into something approaching cheerful. Rich blues and deep greens hung from wooden pegs he carved for her, while golden yellows and warm reds draped across the rough stone walls like captured sunlight. "Tell me about your weaving," Thorlund had requested on the second evening as he shared his simple meal of venison stew and dark bread. It was the first personal question he had asked in 7 years, and the words felt strange in his mouth. Inga's face had brightened at his interest, and she began to describe her work with passion that made even his warrior's heart stir. She spoke of patterns that told stories, great tapestries depicting the legends of their people, smaller pieces that captured the essence of seasons or the personality of beloved animals. Her hands moved as she talked, weaving invisible threads in the air, and Thorlund found himself mesmerized by the grace and certainty of her gestures. "Each thread has its purpose," she explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing sacred knowledge. "Even the darkest colors have their place in the pattern. Without shadow there can be no true light. Without sorrow, joy has no meaning." Her words struck him with unexpected force, for they seemed to speak directly to his own situation. Could it be that even his exile, his shame, his years of bitter isolation served some purpose in a larger pattern he was unable to see? As the days passed, Thorlund found himself sharing fragments of his own past, carefully edited stories of battles fought and victories won in service to his clan. He spoke of the brotherhood of warriors, of the satisfaction found in protecting those who could not protect themselves, of the pride that came from being counted among the greatest fighters of his generation. Inga listened with an attention that was complete and non-judgmental, asking thoughtful questions that drew out details he had not shared with anyone. She wanted to know about the weight of his weapons, the feel of chainmail in bitter cold, the way victory tasted when it was earned through skill rather than mere luck. Her curiosity was genuine and intelligent, unmarked by the horrified fascination that had characterized most people's interest in his warrior past. "You miss it," she observed, after he finished describing a particularly challenging campaign against raiders from the far north. "The brotherhood, the sense of purpose. I miss what it represented," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "I miss being someone who mattered, someone whose actions served a cause greater than mere survival." "And what makes you think you do not matter now?" The question caught him off guard, and he found himself without an easy answer. For so long he had defined his worth through the approval of others, through his reputation and standing within his community. In exile, stripped of all external validation, he had assumed that his life had lost all meaning and value. On the third evening, as they sat before the fire, sharing what had become their customary time of quiet conversation, Inga made a discovery that would prove to be another small step toward deeper understanding. While organizing her weaving threads, her fingers had encountered something unexpected tucked into a corner of the shelter, a collection of wooden objects that felt familiar under her touch. "These are beautiful," she said, holding up what proved to be a set of carved animals, a bear, a wolf, an eagle, and several others. The work was exquisite, each creature captured with such skill and attention to detail that even her fingers could appreciate the artistry involved. Thorlund had frozen when he saw what she had found, his face flushing with embarrassment. They are nothing, idle work to pass the time, but Inga's exploration of the carvings told a different story. These were not crude whittlings made to occupy restless hands, but works of genuine art, created by someone with both skill and deep observation of the natural world. Each animal was unique, captured in a moment of characteristic behavior, the bear rearing up to scent the wind, the wolf mid-stride in pursuit of prey, the eagle with wings spread in the moment before landing. "How long does each one take?" she asked, her fingers tracing the intricate details of feathers and fur. "It depends," he said reluctantly. "The bear took most of a winter. The others, less time. They are wonderful. You have a gift." Her words, spoken with simple sincerity, carried more weight than all the praise he had ever received for his prowess in battle. This was something he had created rather than destroyed. Something beautiful born from patience and careful observation rather than violence and strength. Meanwhile, far below in Raven's Hollow village, Inga's prolonged absence had begun to cause serious concern. Search parties had been organized and sent out as soon as the storm cleared, but the violent weather had washed away all traces of her passage into the forest. The village elders spoke in hushed tones about the possibility that she had perished in the mountains, and plans were being made for memorial services that would honor her contributions to their community. Neither Thorlund nor Inga spoke of her eventual return to the village, though both were acutely aware that their time together was temporary. Instead, they focused on the present moment, on the warmth of the fire and the comfort of shared conversation, on the gradual discovery that loneliness was not an inevitable condition, but a wound that could heal when touched by genuine understanding. Shabish, weaving threads that hung around the shelter, seemed to grow more vibrant each day, as if reflecting the slowly brightening spirits of its inhabitants. And in the corner where Thorlund's carved animals sat, displayed with new pride, the wooden creatures seemed to watch over this unlikely pair with the patient wisdom of those who understood that the most profound transformations often begin with the smallest gestures of kindness. It was on the fourth morning that Inga first touched the bear claw necklace, and with that touch, she began to understand the true depths of the man who had become her unlikely protector. Thorlund had been preparing to check his trap lines, moving about the shelter with the quiet efficiency she had come to recognize as his normal routine, when the leather cord caught on something and the necklace fell to the stone floor with a soft clicking sound. "What was that?" Inga asked, her head turning toward the noise with the precise attention of someone who relied on hearing for navigation. "Nothing of importance," Thorlund said quickly, but she could hear him moving to retrieve whatever had fallen. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand with the patient confidence of someone accustomed to exploring the world through touch. After a moment's hesitation, she felt the weight of the necklace settle into her palm. Her fingers immediately recognized the shape and texture of what she held, a massive claw, easily the length of her thumb, suspended from a cord of braided leather. The claw itself was yellowed with age, but still sharp at the tip, and the leather showed the wear patterns of something that had been handled frequently over many years. "This came from a very large bear," she said, her voice carrying a note of awe. "The largest I have ever seen," Thorlund confirmed, his voice dropping to the tone men used when speaking of experiences that had marked them forever. "It stood taller than me when it reared up on its hind legs. Its paws were the size of dinner platters, and its roar could be heard for miles across the mountains." Inga's fingers continued their exploration of the claw, feeling the smooth wear patterns that spoke of countless hours of handling. "Tell me about it," she said softly. Thorlund settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame. When he began to speak, his voice carried the cadence of a man reliving a defining moment of his life. "It was my 17th winter," he began. "I had been accepted into the warrior band of my clan, but the others still saw me as little more than an eager boy playing at being a man. I had not yet proven myself in true combat, had not yet earned the right to be called a warrior in more than name." The story that followed painted a picture of young Thorlund's desperate need to prove his worth to men whose respect he craved above all else. He had ventured alone into the deepest wilderness, seeking some feat that would silence the doubts about his courage and skill. What he found instead was a creature of legend, a great bear that had been terrorizing settlements throughout the region, killing livestock and threatening anyone who dared enter its territory. "I tracked it for 3 days," Thorlund continued, his voice growing distant with memory. "It was cunning, that beast. It knew it was being followed and led me deeper into the mountains, away from any help, away from any chance of escape if things went badly." The confrontation, when it finally came, had been everything young Thorlund had hoped for, and more terrifying than he had imagined. The bear had chosen its ground carefully, a narrow canyon with steep walls that offered no retreat. When Thorlund finally cornered the creature, he discovered why it had been so confident in leading him to this place. The bear was not just large, but ancient, scarred by countless battles with other predators and marked by an intelligence that was almost human. "In its cunning, my spear broke on its thick hide," Thorlund said, unconsciously touching old scars on his arms as he spoke. "My sword barely scratched it. In the end, it came down to strength against strength, will against will. I had nothing left but my hands and my refusal to die without honor." Inga could picture the scene he described, the young warrior, armed, with nothing but desperate courage, grappling with a creature that could have torn him apart with a single swipe of its massive paws. The battle had lasted what felt like hours, both combatants drawing on reserves of strength and endurance that surprised them both. "How did you finally defeat it?" she asked, though she could guess from the reverent way he spoke of the creature. "That defeat might not be the right word." "I did not defeat it," Thorlund said quietly. "We fought until we were both beyond exhaustion, both bleeding, both at the edge of our strength. And then something changed. I looked into its eyes and saw not a monster but a fellow warrior. It was old, tired, ready for its final battle, and I was young, desperate to prove myself worthy of respect." The climax of the story was not what Inga had expected. Instead of a tale of triumphant victory, Thorlund described a moment of mutual understanding between two fighters who recognized something of themselves in each other. The bear, its strength finally failing, had made one last charge. Thorlund, his own weapons broken or lost, had met that charge with his bare hands. "When it died, it was looking into my eyes," Thorlund said, his voice thick with old emotion. "There was no fear there, no anger, only acceptance, respect perhaps, as if it understood that its death would serve a purpose greater than mere survival. The claw had been given to him by the village elders when he returned with proof of his victory. More than just a trophy, it represented his transition from boy to man, from untested youth to proven warrior. He had worn it ever since, through battles and celebrations, through his marriage and the birth of his children, through the dark day of his exile and all the lonely years that followed. "But you are not that young man anymore," Inga observed, her fingers still tracing the ancient claw. "What does it mean to you now?" Thorlund was quiet for a long time, considering her question with the gravity it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "it reminds me that sometimes the most important battles are not won by the strongest, but by those who understand when to fight and when to show mercy." As they sat together in the warm glow of the fire, Inga began to understand that the fearsome reputation that had driven Thorlund into exile was built on more than just physical strength. This was a man who had learned to see beyond the surface of things, who understood that true courage sometimes meant choosing the harder path rather than the easier one. The bear claw necklace, warm now from her handling, seemed to pulse with its own life as she handed it back to him. In that simple exchange, something shifted between them, a recognition that they were both warriors in their own ways, both survivors of battles that had left them scarred but not broken. Outside, the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the mountain peaks, and Thorlund knew that soon the passes would be closed until spring. If Inga was to return to her village, it would have to be soon. But as he watched her settle back into her work with his weaving threads, humming softly to herself as she created patterns of impossible beauty, he found himself hoping that the snows would come early this year. The discovery came by accident, as the most life-changing revelations often do. Inga had been organizing the far corner of the shelter, her hands methodically cataloguing the various tools and supplies that Thorlund had accumulated during his years of exile. She had learned to move confidently through his space, her fingers mapping every surface and corner until she knew the layout as well as her own cottage. It was this familiarity that made the hidden alcove so surprising when her hand passed through what should have been solid stone. Behind a carefully placed stone slab, her exploring fingers discovered a shallow cavity carved into the living rock of the mountain. Within this hidden space lay objects that Thorlund had clearly meant to keep concealed, personal items too precious or too painful to leave in the open. Her fingers identified a small wooden box, some rolled parchments, and something else that made her breath catch in her throat. The axe was unmistakably a weapon of war, its handle worn smooth by years of use, its blade still sharp despite the dark stains that discolored the metal. But it was not the weapon itself that filled Inga with sudden dread. It was the way her fingers recognized the craftsmanship. This was not some crude tool hastily forged for basic chopping. This was a warrior's axe, beautifully balanced and perfectly weighted, the kind of weapon that would be passed down through generations as a family treasure. And there was something else, a smell that clung to the metal despite the years, something metallic and organic that her heightened senses identified with horrible certainty. This axe had tasted blood, and recently enough that traces of its work still lingered. "What are you doing?" Thorlund's voice, sharp with alarm, cut through her concentration like a blade. She had not heard him return from checking his trap lines, and the sudden sound of his voice in the silence made her gasp and nearly drop the weapon. "I was just organizing," she began, but the words died in her throat as she felt rather than saw his massive presence filling the entrance to the shelter. "Put it down." His voice had changed completely, losing all trace of the gentle warmth. She had grown accustomed to over their days together. This was the voice of Thorlund the Bearblood, the exile whose very name could stop conversations and send children running for their mothers. But Inga's fingers remained frozen around the axe. Endel, her mind racing as fragments of old stories and whispered rumors suddenly began to form a terrible pattern. She thought of the brother whose death had caused Thorlund's exile, of the blood feud that had torn his family apart, of the violence that had transformed a respected warrior into a feared outcast. "This is the axe," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is how you killed him." The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the wind moving through the pines outside, could hear the distant sound of water trickling down the mountain face, could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed too loud for the confined space. When Thorlund finally spoke, his voice was hollow with old pain and fresh shame. Yes, the single word carried the weight of 7 years of guilt, 7 years of reliving that terrible moment when love and duty had collided with consequences that destroyed everything he held dear. Inga felt the truth of it in the way he said it, in the defeat that colored his admission, in the terrible honesty of someone who had stopped trying to justify or explain the worst thing he had ever done. "Tell me," she said, still holding the axe, though her hands were trembling now. No. The refusal was immediate and absolute. You do not want to know. No one should have to carry that knowledge. But Inga had heard enough whispered conversations in the village, had pieced together enough fragments of the story to understand that there was more to his brother's death than simple murder. The very fact that Thorlund had been exiled rather than executed suggested circumstances that even his enemies had found complicated. I need to know, she insisted, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. If I am to understand who you are, I need to know what you have done. Thorlund moved closer, and she could sense the barely controlled violence that radiated from him like heat from a forge. This was the man who had earned his fearsome reputation, the warrior who had killed with his bare hands and felt no remorse for his enemies. But beneath that frightening exterior, she also sensed something else, a deep well of anguish that spoke of a man who had been forced to choose between terrible options and live forever with the consequences. My brother was not a good man, Thorlund said finally, his words coming slowly and reluctantly. He drank too much, gambled away our family's wealth, and when the drink was in him, he became violent. The story that emerged was ugly and complicated, painted in shades of grey rather than the clear blacks and whites that made for easier judgments. Erik Bjornsson had been the elder brother, the heir to their father's holdings, a man whose public charm masked private cruelties that he visited primarily upon those who could not defend themselves. His wife bore the worst of it, Thorlund continued, his voice growing steadier as he forced himself to confront memories he had spent years trying to forget. Astrid was small and gentle, kind to everyone she met. She did not deserve what he did to her. Inga felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as she realized where this story was leading. Her own sister had been named Astrid, had been known for her gentleness and kindness before her death from injuries sustained in what the family had been told was a riding accident. I tried to protect her without confronting him directly, Thorlund said. I thought that family loyalty demanded I find another way, that blood should not spill blood over private matters. I was wrong. The end had come on a winter night when Thorlund returned early from a hunting expedition to find Erik in the midst of one of his rages, beating his wife with a fury that would surely have killed her if not interrupted. The confrontation that followed had been brief and violent, ending with Erik dead and Astrid clinging to life with injuries that would claim her within days. The clan elders understood that I had acted to protect the innocent, Thorlund said, his voice now barely audible, but they also understood that I had killed my own brother, had destroyed the family line and brought shame upon our name. Exile was their compromise. Justice that preserved life while acknowledging that some acts, no matter how justified, carry consequences that cannot be avoided. Inga slowly lowered the axe, her hands shaking as the full weight of his revelation settled over her. This man who had shown her such gentleness, such careful consideration, was the same man who had killed his own brother to protect a woman who could not protect herself. Astrid, she whispered, the name carrying all the pain and complexity of his story. The woman he killed was my sister. Now it was Thorlund's turn to freeze, his entire body going rigid as the implications of her words struck him like a physical blow. For 7 years he had carried the guilt of failing to save Astrid, Eriksdottir, and now, by cruel fate or divine providence, he found himself face to face with the sister who had mourned her death without ever knowing the true circumstances that had caused it. The axe fell from Inga's nerveless fingers, clattering against the stone floor with a sound like thunder in the suddenly suffocating space. Between them lay the weight of old pain and new understanding, of justice and guilt intertwined in ways that defied easy resolution. Outside, the wind continued to blow through the pines, and the first snow of winter began to fall more heavily, sealing them together in the mountain fortress, where secrets had finally been dragged into the light. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that seemed impossible to cross. Inga sat frozen where she had dropped the axe, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the gentle man who had cared for her with the warrior who had killed her sister's husband and failed to save her sister's life. Thorlund stood equally motionless, his massive frame rigid with the shock of discovering that fate had brought him face to face with the one person in the world who had the greatest right to hate him. It was Inga who finally broke the terrible. Quiet, her voice small and uncertain in the flickering firelight. "How long did she live after that night?" 3 days, Thorlund replied, his words barely audible. "She never regained consciousness. I sat with her until the end, hoping she might wake so I could beg her forgiveness for failing to protect her sooner." Tears began to flow down Inga's cheeks as the truth of her sister's death finally came to light. For 7 years, she had mourned Astrid's passing while believing the family's explanation that she had died from injuries sustained in a fall from her horse. The reality that her gentle sister had been beaten to death by her own husband was almost too horrible to comprehend. "We never knew," she whispered. "The message that came to our family said only that she had died from a riding accident. Eric claimed her horse had bolted and thrown her against a tree." Thorlund's face twisted with fresh anguish as he realized the full scope of his brother's cruelty. Even in death, Eric had found a way to deny Astrid the honor she deserved, to hide his crimes behind lies that would preserve his reputation while robbing her family of the truth. "I should have exposed him," Thorlund said, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "I should have told your family what really happened, should have ensured that his evil deeds were known to all. But I was a coward, too ashamed of my own failure to speak the words that would have given you the truth you deserved." As they sat together in the aftermath of this revelation, Inga found herself struggling with emotions too complex to untangle. Grief for her sister mixed with rage at Eric's deception, while gratitude for Thorlund's attempt to protect Astrid warred with anger at his failure to save her. The neat categories of hero and villain that had structured her understanding of the world suddenly seemed woefully inadequate to contain the messy reality of human behavior. "Show me," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to flow. "Show me everything you kept of hers." With hands that shook slightly, Thorlund retrieved the small wooden box from its hiding place and set it before her. Inside, Inga's fingers discovered treasures that told the story of her sister's final months better than any words could have done. There were letters that Astrid had written but never sent, describing her fear and desperation in careful script that grew increasingly shaky as her situation worsened. There were small personal items, an ivory comb, a silver brooch, a leather-bound book of poems that Thorlund had saved from Eric's household before leaving for his exile. But it was the final item that made Inga gasp with recognition and understanding. Her fingers closed around a familiar object that she had not expected to find, a gold ring set with a small sapphire, the betrothal ring that Eric had given to Astrid and that should have been buried with her. He took this from her finger after. "She died," Thorlund explained, his voice thick with disgust. "I found him trying to sell it in the village market the day before her funeral, claiming he needed the money to pay her burial expenses. I took it from him then, and I have carried it ever since, as a reminder of my failure." Inga held the ring up to the firelight, watching the sapphire catch and scatter the orange glow. This simple piece of jewelry represented everything that was wrong with her sister's marriage. Love promised but never given, vows made but never honored, a commitment that had become a prison rather than a partnership. "But there is something else," Thorlund continued, his voice carrying a note of additional pain. "Something I have never told anyone, something that makes my guilt even heavier to bear." He moved to a different part of the hidden alcove and withdrew a larger object wrapped in soft cloth. When he unwrapped it, Inga's hands discovered something that took her breath away, a weaving loom, smaller than her own but exquisitely crafted, every surface polished to silky smoothness by years of loving use. This was Astrid's loom, Thorlund said quietly. She was working at it the night I found them, had been trying to escape his anger by focusing on her weaving. Her hands were bleeding from where he had struck her, but she was still trying to work, still trying to find some small corner of peace in the chaos of her life. Inga's fingers traced the familiar contours of the loom, recognizing the specific style of construction that marked it as the work of their father's hands. He had made one for each of his daughters, crafting them with all the love and skill he possessed. Inga's own loom had been created first, when she showed early promise as a weaver, despite her blindness. Astrid's had come later, fashioned when she expressed interest in following her sister's path. "You kept this all these years," Inga said, wonder and sorrow mixing in her voice. "I could not leave it with him," Thorlund replied. "It was the only thing in that house that spoke of beauty rather than violence, the only thing that carried her spirit rather than his poison. I thought perhaps someday I might find someone worthy to receive it, someone who would understand its value and treat it with the respect it deserved." As Inga continued to explore the loom with reverent fingers, she began to understand the true depth of Thorlund's penance. For 7 years, he had carried not just the guilt of his failure to save her sister, but also the responsibility of preserving her memory through these carefully guarded treasures. He had become the keeper of Astrid's story, the guardian of her honor in a world that had chosen to forget the truth of her suffering. "She was working on something when she died," Thorlund continued, his voice growing softer. "A tapestry unlike anything I had ever seen. The threads were arranged in patterns that seemed to tell the story of her life, but also something more, something about hope and redemption, about finding light in the darkest places." He produced the unfinished work from another bundle, and Inga's hands immediately recognized her sister's distinctive style. The weaving was indeed extraordinary, showing a level of skill and artistry that Astrid had never displayed in her earlier work. It was as if her suffering had somehow purified her craft, allowing her to create something of transcendent beauty, even as her world collapsed around her. "I have wondered," Thorlund said hesitantly, "if perhaps she was trying to tell me something through her work. If perhaps she knew somehow that her time was running short and wanted to leave behind some message of forgiveness or understanding." Inga studied the unfinished tapestry with all the expertise her years of weaving had given her, reading the story that her sister had tried to tell through thread and pattern. What she found there made her heart ache with new understanding, for this was indeed a message woven with love and hope by a woman who had somehow found the strength to forgive even as she faced her own death. The central pattern of the tapestry showed 2 figures, a warrior and a woman, standing together beneath a tree whose branches reached toward a star-filled sky. The warrior bore the scars of many battles, his face marked by pain and regret, while the woman's hands glowed with golden light that seemed to heal the darkness around them. It was a vision of redemption, of love's power to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. "She forgave you," Inga whispered, her voice filled with awe and certainty. "Even as she was dying, she forgave you for not being able to save her sooner. This tapestry, it is her way of telling you that your guilt is unnecessary, that love can heal even the wounds we inflict upon ourselves." As the full implications of this discovery settled over them, Inga felt the last barriers between herself and Thorlund begin to crumble. Here was a man who had carried her sister's memory with honor for 7 years, who had preserved her dignity when no one else would, who had punished himself for crimes that were not truly his own. And here, in her sister's final work, was proof that even Astrid herself had understood the complexity of his situation and had chosen forgiveness over condemnation. The ring, the loom, the unfinished tapestry, all of these artifacts spoke of love that transcended death, of connections that could not be broken by violence or time. And as Inga reached across the space between them to take Thorlund's scarred hand in her own, she realized that her sister's greatest gift might not be the treasures he had preserved, but the love story that was only now beginning to unfold in this mountain sanctuary where two damaged souls had finally found each other. The transformation that followed their shared revelation was profound and immediate. Where there had been careful distance and polite boundaries, now there was an intimacy born of complete understanding. Inga worked at her sister's loom in the days that followed, her fingers flying across the familiar frame as she completed the tapestry that Astrid had begun 7 years earlier. Each thread she added seemed to weave their two stories together more tightly, creating a pattern that spoke of love, transcending death, of forgiveness, healing ancient wounds. Thorlund watched her work with a mixture of wonder and growing dread. The tapestry was becoming something magnificent under her skilled hands, a masterpiece that told the story of redemption, in images so beautiful they seemed to glow with their own inner light. But as the days passed and the work neared completion, he could not escape the knowledge that their time together was running short. The snows were falling more heavily now, and soon the mountain passes would be completely blocked until spring. "You should return to your village before the winter sets in completely," he said on the morning when she put the final stitches into the tapestry. The words felt like stones in his mouth, but he forced himself to speak them anyway. "Your people will be mourning you as dead. They deserve to know that you live." Inga's hands stilled on the completed work, her fingers tracing the final pattern she had added, a representation of two souls joined together beneath the same star-filled sky that Astrid had begun. "And what if I do not wish to return alone?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge that neither quite dared to cross. For all their growing closeness, all their shared understanding, neither had spoken aloud of the feelings that had developed during their time together. Thorlund was a man marked by exile and violence, while Inga was a respected member of the community that had cast him out. The gulf between their situations seemed insurmountable. "I cannot ask you to share my exile," Thorlund said finally. "You have a life in Raven's Hollow, people who depend on you, a place of honor and respect. I would not see you throw all of that away for the sake of a man who has nothing to offer but a hard life in the wilderness." But Inga was no longer the same woman who had stumbled lost into his territory weeks earlier. The isolation and intimacy of their time together had shown her things about herself that she had never known, had awakened desires and dreams that she had thought buried forever beneath the practical necessities of her solitary existence. "What if there was another way?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of determination that made him look at her with new attention. "What if, instead of me joining you in exile, we both returned to face whatever judgment awaits?" The suggestion struck Thorlund like a physical blow. For 7 years he had assumed that his exile was permanent, that he would never again walk among civilized people or call any place home except the wilderness that had sheltered him. The idea of voluntary return, of facing the community that had cast him out, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. "They would kill me," he said simply. "The younger warriors especially have long memories and quick tempers. They would see my return not as seeking redemption, but as defying the elders' judgment." "Perhaps," Inga admitted, "but perhaps not. 7 years is a long time, and people change. The story of what you did for my sister, the true story, has never been told. If they understood that you acted to protect the innocent, if they saw the man you have become, rather than the one you were." She let the words trail off, but Thorlund could hear the hope in her voice, the belief that love might indeed be powerful, enough to overcome the barriers that separated them. It was a beautiful dream, but he had learned to be wary of beautiful dreams. They had a way of turning into nightmares when exposed to the harsh light of reality. Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that made Thorlund's blood freeze. In his veins, the distant baying of hunting hounds carried on the wind from somewhere far below in the valley. The sound was unmistakable, and it meant only one thing. A search party had finally picked up Inga's trail and was following it toward his hidden sanctuary. "We must leave," Thorlund said, his warrior instincts immediately taking control. "Now, before they get closer." But Inga shook her head, her face set with a resolution that surprised him. "No. If they have found us, then running will only make things worse. This may be the opportunity we need, the chance to face them together, to tell the truth about what happened, to seek the redemption that has eluded you for so long." "You do not understand," Thorlund said urgently, beginning to gather weapons and supplies with the automatic efficiency of a man who had spent years ready to flee at a moment's notice. "These will not be reasonable men seeking reasonable conversation. They will be warriors looking for glory, young men eager to prove themselves by bringing down the legendary exile. They will not listen to explanations before they act." "Then we must make them listen," Inga said firmly. "We must find a way to reach them before violence becomes inevitable." As if summoned by their words, the sound of the hounds grew closer, accompanied now by the voices of men calling to each other across the mountainside. Thorlund could make out individual words now, his name spoken with hatred and anticipation, Inga's name called with desperate hope. The search party was large, perhaps a dozen men or more, and they were moving with the confidence of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. Thorlund moved to the entrance of the shelter and carefully moved aside the camouflaged covering that concealed it from outside view. Through the narrow opening, he could see torches moving through the trees below, their light dancing wildly in the increasing snowfall. The hunters were still perhaps an hour away, but they were definitely following the right path. "There is still time to escape," he said, turning back to Inga. "I know paths they do not, ways through the mountains that would take us far from here." Before they realized, we were gone, but Inga was already moving toward the completed tapestry, rolling it carefully and securing it with ribbon from her supply pouch. "Help me pack Astrid's things," she said calmly. "If we are going to face them, we should bring proof of what really happened 7 years ago." Despite his fear for her safety, Thorlund found himself moved by her courage. Here was a woman who had discovered strength she never knew she possessed, who was willing to risk everything for the chance of a future together. As he helped her carefully pack the artifacts they had discovered, the ring, the letters, the various personal items that told the story of Astrid's suffering, he felt something he had not experienced in 7 years. Hope. "Are you certain about this?" he asked as they made their final preparations. "Once we step outside this shelter, there will be no going back. Whatever happens, our lives will never be the same." Inga reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture that spoke of complete trust and unwavering commitment. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." As they stepped out into the swirling snow, leaving behind the sanctuary that had sheltered their growing love, both Thorlund and Inga understood that they were walking toward a confrontation that would determine not just their own futures, but possibly their very survival. The torches below were moving closer now, and soon there would be no more time for planning or preparation. Behind them, the mountain shelter stood empty except for the dying embers of their fire and the loom where Astrid's story had finally been completed. Ahead lay the unknown, judgment or redemption, death or new life, the end of their story or its true beginning. But whatever awaited them in the darkness below, they would meet it as they had learned to meet everything else. Together, with courage. Born of love and hope, sustained by the belief that even the most damaged souls could find their way home. The hunting party emerged from the tree line like wolves circling prey, their torches casting wild shadows against the swirling snow. Thorlund counted 12 men in total, more than enough to overwhelm even a warrior of his legendary skill, especially when they held the advantage of numbers and preparation. At their head walked Gunnar Ironside, a young warrior whose father had died in the same campaign where Thorlund had first earned his reputation. The hatred in Gunnar's eyes was personal and absolute. "Thorlund Bjornsson!" Gunnar called out, his voice carrying clearly across the small clearing where the exile and the weaver had chosen to make their stand. "By order of the village elders, you will surrender yourself for judgment. Your crimes have been discovered and your time of hiding is at an end. What crimes would those be?" Thorlund replied, his voice calm despite the desperate nature of their situation. Beside him, Inga stood with quiet dignity, the bundled tapestry and artifacts clutched against her chest like precious shields. "The murder of your brother," Gunnar spat, "the theft of his property, and now the kidnapping of Inga Eriksdottir, daughter of our village, who has been missing for weeks because of your villainy." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hunting party, and Thorlund could see the bloodlust building in their eyes. These men had come not for justice, but for vengeance, eager to prove themselves against a legend and claim the glory of bringing down the feared exile. "I have kidnapped no one," Thorlund said firmly. "Inga Eriksdottir came to my shelter seeking refuge from the storm. She has remained of her own free will." "Lies," Gunnar snarled, stepping forward with his hand on his sword hilt. "What woman would willingly stay with a murderer and exile? You have clearly bewitched her or threatened her into compliance." It was then that Inga stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong in the mountain air. "I speak for myself, Gunnar Ironside, and I tell you that Thorlund Bjornsson has shown me nothing but kindness and protection. He saved my life when I was lost in the storm, and he has cared for me with honor ever since." The hunting party fell, silent, clearly not expecting the supposed victim to defend her supposed captor. Gunnar's face twisted with confusion and anger as his simple narrative of rescue and revenge began to crumble before his eyes. "You have been his prisoner too long," Gunnar said finally. "Your mind has been turned by fear and isolation. When we return you to the village, you will remember the truth of what this monster has done to you." But Inga was far from finished. Handing the bundled artifacts to Thorlund, she stepped closer to the ring of torchlight, her unseeing eyes somehow finding each face in the hunting party with uncanny accuracy. "Before you condemn this man," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected, "you will hear the truth about the night Erik Bjornsson died. You will learn why Thorlund was exiled, and you will understand that the monster you seek does not exist." "We know what happened," one of the other warriors protested. "He killed his own brother in cold blood, violated the most sacred bonds of family loyalty." "Do you?" Inga challenged. "Then tell me, Bjorn. Olafsson, how did my sister Astrid really die?" The man she had addressed, a stocky warrior with greying beard, shifted uncomfortably at her question. "She died in a riding accident. Her horse threw her against a tree. That is what Erik told my family," Inga said, her voice heavy with accumulated pain. "That is the lie that has hidden the truth for 7 years. But I have learned what really happened that night, and you deserve to know as well." She gestured to Thorlund, who slowly unwrapped the artifacts they had brought from the shelter. In the flickering torchlight, the men could see the ring, the letters, the personal items that told the story of a woman's suffering. But it was the sight of the blood-stained axe that made several of them step back with sharp intakes of breath. "This is the weapon that killed Erik Bjornsson," Inga said calmly. "But it was not used in murder. It was used in defense of the innocent. Erik was beating my sister to death when Thorlund found them. He acted to save her life, not to take his brother's." The revelation hit the hunting party like a physical blow. Several of the men had known Astrid during her brief marriage to Erik, and they remembered her gentle nature and kind spirit. The idea that she had died not from an accident, but from brutal violence, struck them with horror. "Even if that is true," Gunnar said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty, "it does not justify brother killing brother. There are laws, proper ways to handle such disputes." "What laws?" Thorlund spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice carrying decades of bitter experience. What laws protect a woman from her husband's fists? What court would take the word of a wife against that of a respected clan leader? You know as well as I do that Eric's public reputation would have protected him from any formal accusation. You could have brought the matter before the elders, another warrior suggested, but his words lacked conviction. I tried, Thorlund said simply. For months I tried to find ways to protect Astrid without destroying my family. I spoke to Eric privately, warning him that his behavior was unacceptable. I offered to take Astrid into my own household, claiming she could help, care for my children. I even suggested that he send her away to visit relatives until his temper cooled. And what was his response? Inga asked, though she already knew the answer. He laughed at me, Thorlund said, his voice hollow with old pain. He told me that his wife was his property to do with as he pleased, and that if I interfered further, he would make sure she paid the price for my meddling. The beating that killed her was his way of showing me what happened to those who crossed him. The hunting party stood in stunned silence as the full implications of this revelation sank in. Many of them were married men themselves, fathers who understood the sacred duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. The idea that they had spent 7 years condemning a man who had acted with honor rather than dishonor shook the foundations of their understanding. It was then that the village horn sounded from the valley below, 3 long blasts that echoed off the mountain walls with mournful authority. The signal meant that the village elders had arrived, summoned by runners who had reported the discovery of Thorlund's location. "The elders come," Gunnar said, his voice subdued. "They will want to hear this tale for themselves." As if in response to his words, new torches appeared at the edge of the forest, and the hunting party could see a procession of older men making their way up the mountain path. At their head walked Olaf the Grey, eldest of the village council, and a man whose wisdom was respected throughout the region. "Then we will tell them," Inga said firmly. "We will tell them everything, and let them judge whether the exile of Thorlund Bjornsson serves justice or merely perpetuates a lie." The village horn that had summoned the elders now served as the artifact that would determine their fate, a call to judgment that could mean death or redemption, continued exile, or the possibility of coming home. As the sound of its call faded into the mountain air, Thorlund and Inga prepared to face the most important trial of their lives. The procession of elders ascended the mountain path with the solemnity of men approaching a sacred rite. Olaf the Grey led them, his ancient frame moving with surprising strength despite his 80 winters. Behind him came the other members of the village council, Harald Stormwind, Magnus the Law Speaker, and Eirik the Wise, men whose collective memory stretched back to the founding of Raven's Hollow itself. When they reached the clearing where Thorlund and Inga waited with their escort of hunters, Olaf's piercing blue eyes took in the scene with the shrewd assessment of one who had presided over countless disputes and judgments. His gaze lingered on the artifacts spread before them, on Inga's composed dignity, and finally on Thorlund himself, the exile who had become legend in his absence. 7 years have passed since last we met, Thorlund Bjornsson, Olaf said, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered ground. 7 years since the judgment stone received your oath of exile. Why do you return now? "I do not return by choice, honored elder," Thorlund replied, inclining his head with the respect due to Olaf's position and years. "I was discovered while offering aid to one who was lost in the storm. I have violated no term of my exile by remaining in the wilderness where you sent me. Yet here you stand before us once again," Magnus the Law Speaker observed, "and here stands Inga Eriksdottir, who has been mourned as dead by her people for weeks. Explain to us how these things have come to pass." It was Inga who answered, stepping forward with the completed tapestry in her hands. "Honored elders, I came before you to speak not as a victim, but as a witness to truth that has been hidden for too long. I ask that you hear my words and judge whether justice has been served. or merely delayed? The elders exchanged glances, clearly not expecting the supposed victim to serve as advocate for the man they had come to judge, but Olaf nodded gravely, gesturing for her to continue. You sentenced Thorlund Bjornsson to exile for the killing of his brother, Inga said, her voice steady and clear. But the full truth of that night was never spoken in your hearing. Erik Bjornsson was not an innocent victim, but a man whose private cruelties had long been hidden from public view. She began to unfold the tapestry, revealing the magnificent work that she and Astrid had created together across the span of 7 years. The images woven into the fabric told the story more powerfully than words ever could. A gentle woman suffering in silence, a warrior torn between duty and conscience, a moment of violence that was both tragedy and necessity. My sister Astrid was Erik's wife, Inga continued, her fingers tracing the patterns in the cloth. She died not from a riding accident, as we were told, but from injuries inflicted by her husband's fists. This tapestry was her final work, begun on the night she died and completed by my own hands these past weeks. In it, she tells the story of her suffering and her gratitude to the man who tried to save her. The elders studied the tapestry with growing amazement and horror. The images were undeniably clear in their meaning, and the skill required to create such work spoke to its authenticity. Here was evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. You claim this tapestry was begun by your sister 7 years ago, Harold Stormwind asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I know my sister's work as well as my own, Inga replied firmly. Every stitch in the central portion bears her distinctive style. The outer portions, which I completed during my time in Thorlund's care, continue her pattern but show the differences in our techniques. Olaf the Grey approached the tapestry and examined it closely, his experienced eyes reading the story woven into its fibers. When he looked up, his face was grave with new understanding. If this is true, he said slowly, then we have permitted a great injustice to stand unchallenged for 7 years. Magnus, what does the law say about a man who kills in defense of the innocent? The law speaker stroked his beard thoughtfully. The law recognizes the right of any person to use force in protection of those who cannot protect themselves. If Erik Bjornsson was indeed beating his wife to death, and if Thorlund acted to prevent her murder, then his actions would be justified under the ancient codes. But he was still obligated to report his actions to the proper authorities. Erik, the wise, pointed out, the concealment of a killing, even a justified one, carries its own penalties. Thorlund stepped forward, his massive frame somehow managing to convey humility despite its intimidating size. Honored elders, I accept full responsibility for my failure to report the true circumstances immediately. I was a coward, too ashamed of my failure to save Astrid's life, to speak the words that might have cleared my name. I chose exile rather than explanation because I believed I deserved punishment for my inability to protect her sooner. And what of these artifacts? Olaf asked, gesturing to the ring, letters and other items that told Astrid's story. How do they bear upon this matter? Inga carefully displayed each item, explaining its significance and the story it told. The letters revealed the progression of Astrid's fear and desperation. The ring showed Erik's callous disregard for his wife's memory. The personal items demonstrated the care with which Thorlund had preserved her dignity in death. For 7 years, Inga concluded, this man has carried the burden of my sister's memory, protecting her honor when no one else would, punishing himself for crimes that were not truly his own. If justice demands punishment for his actions that night, then let it also acknowledge the penance he has already paid. The elders withdrew a short distance to confer among themselves, their voices low but urgent as they debated the implications of these revelations. The hunters who had come seeking a simple capture now found themselves witnesses to a complex moral reckoning that challenged everything they thought they knew. Finally, Olaf returned to where Thorlund and Inga waited. In his hands, he carried an object that made several of the onlookers gasp with recognition, an ancient stone that had served as the symbol of judgment in their community for generations beyond counting. The judgment stone was only brought forth for the most serious decisions, and its presence meant that what happened next would be binding and final. "Thorlund Bjornsson," Olaf said formally, his voice carrying the weight of ages, "you stand accused of concealing the circumstances of your brother's death and thereby perpetuating an injustice. How do you answer this charge?" "Guilty, honored elder," Thorlund replied without hesitation. "I confess my cowardice and accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate." "And Inga Eriksdottir," Olaf continued, "you stand as witness to events that occurred 7 years past, and advocate for one who has lived apart from our community since that time. Do you vouch for the truth of your testimony?" "I do, honored elder," Inga said firmly. "I stake my reputation and my life upon the truth of what I have spoken." Olaf lifted the judgment stone above his head, its ancient surface catching the torchlight like a star fallen to earth. "Then let this assembly hear the judgment of the council," he declared, his voice ringing across the mountainside. The exile of Thorlund Bjornsson was based upon incomplete understanding of his actions. While his failure to report the true circumstances was wrong, his actions in defense of the innocent were justified and honorable. A collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled men as years of assumed truth were swept away by this formal acknowledgement. "Furthermore," Olaf continued, "the council finds that Thorlund Bjornsson has demonstrated through his years of penance and his care for Astrid Eriksdottir's memory that he is a man of honor who has paid in full for any wrong he may have committed. If he wishes to return to our community, he will be welcomed as a citizen in good standing." The judgment stone was lowered, and with it the weight of 7 years of exile and shame was lifted from Thorlund's shoulders. Around the clearing, men who had come as hunters now knelt in acknowledgement of the justice that had finally been served. But the greatest transformation was yet to come. For as Inga moved to Thorlund's side, her hand finding his with the certainty of one who had found her true home, it became clear that this night had witnessed not just the end of an exile, but the beginning of a love story that would be told for generations to come. 6 months later, as the spring thaw painted the fjords with wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings, the village of Ravenshollow prepared for a celebration unlike any in living memory. The wedding of Thorlund Bjornsson and Inga Eriksdottir had become more than just a union between two people. It had become a symbol of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. The wedding quilt that would uncover their marriage bed had been woven by the women of the village, each contributing threads that told pieces of the story that had brought them to this moment. Astrid's tapestry served as the centerpiece, surrounded by patterns that spoke of love conquering fear, of exile ending in homecoming, of two souls finding completion in each other. Thorlund stood at the edge of the village square, marveling at the transformation that had occurred not just in his circumstances, but in himself. The man who had lived alone for 7 years, who had forgotten what it meant to be part of a community, now found himself at the center of a celebration that included faces both familiar and new. Former enemies had become friends, and the name that had once been spoken in whispers of fear was now called with respect and affection. He wore new clothes for the occasion, garments sewn by Inga's own hands in the months since their return to Ravenshollow. The fabric was deep blue, the color of winter storms that had once reflected in his eyes, but now held warmth rather than bitter cold. Around his neck, he still wore the bear claw necklace, but its meaning had changed. Where once it had reminded him of violence and isolation, now it spoke of strength tempered by wisdom. of the wildness within him that Inga had chosen to love rather than fear. Inga herself was radiant in a dress of white wool, adorned with golden threads that caught the afternoon sunlight like captured stars. Her hair was braided with ribbons. She had woven herself, and around her neck she wore Astrid's ring on a chain, not as a reminder of tragedy, but as a symbol of love that transcended death. Her sister's blessing seemed to shine from every thread of the wedding quilt, every pattern in her dress, every smile that graced her face. The ceremony itself was conducted by Olaf the Grey, whose words carried the weight of law and the warmth of genuine affection for the couple before him. As he spoke the ancient vows that would bind Thorlund and Inga together, his voice painted pictures of the journey they had traveled, from strangers lost in a storm to partners ready to face whatever the future might bring. "You have already been tested by adversity," Olaf said, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "You have faced exile and isolation, truth and consequence, fear and forgiveness. What marriage could hold terrors greater than what you have already overcome together?" The laughter that rippled through the assembled villagers was warm and inclusive, speaking of a community that had learned to embrace complexity rather than demand simple answers. Children who had once been told stories of Thorlund, the monster, now listened with wide eyes to tales of Thorlund the Protector, the man who had sacrificed everything to defend the innocent. When the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration began in earnest, Thorlund found himself surrounded by people eager to share their own stories of redemption and second chances. Magnus, the law speaker, spoke of laws that had been changed as a result of Astrid's story, new protections for women who found themselves in dangerous marriages. Harold Stormwind described plans for a memorial garden where Astrid would be honored, not as a victim, but as someone whose death had led to positive change. But it was the children who moved Thorlund most deeply. Young Astrid, the blacksmith's daughter whose fever had originally sent Inga into the forest, approached him with shy curiosity, her small hand reaching out to touch the bear-claw necklace that had once symbolized his fearsome reputation. "Tell me about the bear," she said, with the directness that only children possess. As Thorlund knelt to her level and began to share the story of his encounter with the great creature, he realized that the tale had changed in the telling. Where? Once it had been about violence and conquest, now it spoke of respect and understanding, of the moment when two warriors recognized something worthwhile in each other. The bear in his story was no longer a monster to be defeated, but a teacher who had shown him the difference between strength and mere brutality. As the celebration continued into the evening, Thorlund and Inga found quiet moments to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this place. They spoke of plans for their future, a home they would build together on the outskirts of the village, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough away to provide the peace and privacy they had learned to value. Inga would continue her weaving, her reputation now enhanced by the story of how her art had helped reveal truth and bring justice. Thorlund would serve as the village's protector, his skills as a warrior channeled toward defending rather than destroying. "Do you think she would approve?" Inga asked as they stood together watching the dancing that had begun around the central fire. She was speaking of Astrid, whose presence seemed to bless their union even in her absence. "I think she would be happy that her story led to something beautiful," Thorlund replied, his arm tightening around his new wife's shoulders. "I think she would be glad that love grew from the seeds of her sacrifice." As the night wore on and the celebration gradually wound down, the newlyweds made their way to the home that had been prepared for them, a cottage that stood where the old boundaries between village and wilderness met. It was a perfect metaphor for their life together, bridging the gap between civilization and the wild places, between community and solitude, between the past that had shaped them and the future they would create together. The wedding quilt that covered their bed, told their story in threads of gold and silver, blue and green, colors that spoke of sky and sea, mountain and meadow, all the varied landscapes of a life lived fully and without regret. As they settled into their new life together, surrounded by the tangible proof of their community's acceptance and support, both Thorlund and Inga understood that they had found something rarer than gold or glory. They had found home. In the months and years that followed, their story would become legend in its own right, told around fires and woven into tapestries, passed down through generations as proof that even the most damaged souls could find healing in love. Children would grow up hearing how the giant who had frightened their grandparents became the protector who guarded their sleep, how the blind weaver had seen more clearly than anyone with sight, how two people who seemed destined for loneliness had instead found the greatest love story their village had ever known, and on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the fire burned low in their hearth, Thorlund and Inga would sometimes take out Astrid's completed tapestry and marvel at the pattern she had begun, a design that had seemed to predict their story before it had even begun. Threads of destiny woven together by hands that understood that every ending was also a beginning. Every loss contained the seeds of something found. The village bell that had once reminded Thorlund of his exile now called him home each evening, its bronze voice carrying across the fjord like a promise that some exiles do end, some wounds do heal, and some love stories are strong enough to redeem even the darkest chapters of the past. In its clear, sweet tone, those who listened carefully could hear the echo of other voices, Astrid's among them, singing their approval of a tale that had found its way to the only ending that mattered. Two souls, once lost, now forever found in each other.